Being the giant organization that it is, the United Nations is often the target of criticism. Many people feel that the UN does not succeed at its mission to prevent international conflict and to offer a platform for dialogue. When the United Nations was formed after the League of Nations failed to stop World War II, the world was still attempting to deal with the atrocities of war. Since then, there has not been another world war, but there has definitely been international conflict. Stemming from the failure to prevent things like the Rwandan or Serbian genocide, some feel that in recent years, the United Nations has not served its purpose and is no longer a necessity.
Delegates from all over the world gather in London to open the first assembly of the United Nations organization. Representatives of the peace-loving countries attend a reception prior to the meeting. King George VI is present with British Foreign Secretary Bevin and Secretary of State Burns. The informal gathering strikes a note of harmonious accord as England's Prime Minister Attlee joins the group. Central Hall, Westminster is the meeting place for the 51-member nations. The Canadian delegation is confident of a strong world organization dedicated to a peaceful solution of international difficulties. Edward Stettinius confers with the Secretary of State, and Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt greets a colleague.
When World War II had ended and the horrors of the conflict had been discovered, the need for an international body that would help prevent this from ever happening again was apparent. It was in the days after the war that representatives from 50 countries met at the San Francisco War Memorial to sign the Charter of the United Nations. The Charter of the United Nations is where the UN draws its power from. The articles of the Charter outline the structure of the UN, its subsidiary organizations, how membership works, and where the power of the UN comes from. Particular attention should be paid to the preamble of the Charter, as it shows what the UN was created to do and to accomplish. When you think about the UN, it is important to think about it as being composed of two parts. One part being the more publicized peacekeeping portion, the other being the much less publicized, yet much larger humanitarian development portion. When it comes to critics of the UN, most take issue with something relating to the peacekeeping part.
The UN is supposed to be protecting these people, and yet these peacekeepers, they're just not probably trained well enough, or I don't know what the issue is, but you have the peacekeepers who are stationed in these volatile countries actually committing crimes against, the people, but they have immunity, right? They have international immunity, so they can't be punished, but you have them involved in sex trafficking, in rape, in, coercion, all of these other issues.
I think the number one failure in my mind of the UN would be the genocide in Rwanda. That due to the lack of power that the United Nations has to act on conflict, they simply had to be observers of, an incident that in 1 month's time killed hundreds of thousands of people. So I think that was a major failure and makes one question what the point of having an organization like the UN is.
But that is only one area of the work of the UN and international affairs. Frankly, the larger work is within development and humanitarian relief. And these are all things that basically every country in the world agrees on, that we need to lift billions of people out of poverty and improve the living conditions of all these people.
It is through the humanitarian and development portion that the UN has accomplished three of its greatest triumphs: the Declaration of Human Rights, the Millennium Development Goals, and the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. Along with these larger declarations and treaties, the smaller subsidiary organizations of the UN have enjoyed successes on smaller projects. Although less known, the work of the humanitarian development portion of the UN has been integral to advances of lesser developed countries. These organizations cover a wide range of tasks.
Make it easier to provide international coordination on issues like telecommunications or trade or financial relations or dealing with hunger or disease, and providing assistance to very poor countries. So that largely occurs under the radar and is done by technical experts. So they take money which is donated by other countries and they use it to provide this kind of aid. And they also coordinate their day-to-day relations with each other. And a lot of this works very smoothly and doesn't get very much attention, but this coordination occurs through these various specialized bodies of the United Nations.
Other critics of the UN claim that how the UN is organized, in such institutions as national sovereignty, tie the UN's hands in such a way that they cannot accomplish their goals. Although it is true the setup of the UN and its voting procedures can often be seen as an obstacle to overcome to accomplish good, there are specific reasons for why it is set up the way it is. The Security Council of the UN is comprised of 15 members, 5 of whom are permanent members. Those 5 permanent members have the ability to veto any resolution just by voting no.
Yeah, the way it's set up now is a compromise, okay? So in other words, the significant thing about the Security Council is that it has the power to make legally binding resolutions, unlike the General Assembly. So when the General Assembly makes a resolution, it's just a statement of opinion. Technically, as a matter of international law, by joining the United Nations, you agree to accept decisions made by the Security Council if the Security Council states that they're decisions that are binding on the members. Now, if you made it easy for the Security Council to pass resolutions, what would happen is it would pass tons of resolutions that were legally binding that would be ignored constantly, far more than they are ignored now. So it would mean that the Security Council would be turned into a kind of parody of international law where, like voting majorities in the United Nations, which reflect, the wishes of blocks of authoritarian regimes, largely in Africa and Asia, those coalitions, they would sort of be able to write their own constitution of the world, just by fiat. But that wouldn't be acceptable to most other countries in the world, so they would simply refuse to abide by those resolutions, and the Security Council would be completely ineffective. On the other hand, if you made it too difficult to block resolutions, if you gave everybody a veto, it would never pass any decisions. So the current compromise basically assumes that it shouldn't pass any resolutions unless there's a high degree of consensus among the great powers. And the idea behind that after World War II was supposed to be that the United Nations should govern in a way which has follow-through, right? Where it has the potential to implement, the Security Council has the potential to implement its directives. The assumption is that if one or more of the great powers doesn't agree, it won't work. Because, the League of Nations, the interwar League of Nations, is viewed as a failure, right? It never stopped aggression. It was ineffective. So the idea was the United Nations is only going to be able to work if there is consensus among the great powers. So you can agree or not agree with that institutional setup, but that's the premise of it. So in other words, no resolutions on controversial issues unless all the great powers agree. And again, if you make it really easy to pass resolutions, it will just be ignored.
National sovereignty is also seen as a hoop that the UN has to jump through to succeed at its goals. National sovereignty is the right of every nation to govern itself. The UN cannot force a state to do anything. All it can do is recommend that the nation accept its help or put in place its resolutions.
Here's the thing, most countries do want to work with the United Nations. Yes, the UN agrees, and I think basically every member state agrees. The UN is not going to work in a country unless the national government allows it to do so. And when you get to conflict situations like in Syria or Libya or any conflict situation, yes, that is going to be an issue, and this is the boundary that we're trying to push. But in most countries, specifically developing countries and especially least developed countries, the governments want to work with the United Nations, other national governments, and NGOs in order to carry out development projects and to achieve specifically the Millennium Development Goals. So there are millions of people around the world who are affected by the UN's work, just in development alone, not even getting into peace and security or other political issues. And they're doing fantastic work. And they're the ones who are supposed to be doing it, the ones who really can do it. And so, national sovereignty is important, and that goes into more of the political and peacekeeping issues and like human rights issues.
You would be hard-pressed to find someone who believes that the UN is a perfect organization. It has been 68 years since the Charter was ratified, and times have changed in that period. Just as the times have changed, the UN has to change as well.
Making it a better organization, yeah, it's a matter of resources. There are so many things that need to be done. There are so many things that are happening now that are horrific. You know what a cluster bomb is? A cluster bomb is a kind of munition that falls out of an airplane, and it's kind of a big container. And just before it gets 1,000 feet above the ground, this thing explodes, and hundreds of baseball-sized cluster bombs. They're all clustered together, and then boom, they're spread all over. They've been used in places that long after the warring that led to cluster bombs being dumped on them, people go out and they work with hand tools in fields to cultivate their rice and cassava or whatever kind of basic human farming, and they hit one of those little cluster bombs and are blown to kingdom come. Kids step on them and their legs are gone. It's an obscene, ugly thing, and the UN it was December 2 years ago, had the Oslo Convention on Cluster Munitions, and we could not persuade the US to sign on to that. Hey, let's stop making these things. Not only are they horrific, inhuman, but there are so many of them out there now. The treaties have been signed, the people are not at war, they just want to get going, and they last forever. Well, I don't know about forever, but they've lasted 20, 30 years. That kind of work we have to do much, much more of, and we have to lead, because we won't sign it. The US won't sign it.
In 1945, the United Nations was created to prevent us, the citizens of the world, from ever having to experience the scourge of war as those who signed the Declaration had, as well as to reaffirm human rights. The UN has not always succeeded at these goals, and often they have failed, leading to a huge toll on human life. But at its most basic level, the United Nations is a platform for all of the world's nations to talk and work together to face the issues we face as a community.
Winston Churchill, the man who had to speak for beleaguered Britain throughout World War II, as it started to show up, he became Prime Minister at the moment of the declaration of war against Nazi Germany. But in the years shortly after, he was in a conference with Dwight Eisenhower, who was, of course, the great military leader of the Allied forces in Europe. And when Churchill said, "It's always better to jaw than to war. You know, and even if you have to jaw till late in the night and come back tomorrow and not get things done, you can't walk away from the table of, let's resolve this without bombs, planes, dead people."
The United Nations offers us a place to jaw, and as long as that is possible, it is necessary.